día de hoy contamos con la presencia de un muy destacado investigador, Branko Milanovic, que está en México para presentar un nuevo libro de los muchos que ha escrito. Esta vez ha escrito el libro Desigualdad Mundial, que es un libro sobre la desigualdad en el mundo en el contexto de la globalización. Es un libro que se suma a uno de los muchos libros que ha escrito Branko Milanovic, que es un destacado experto mundial que trabajó durante muchos años en el Banco Mundial, egresado de la Universidad de Belgrado y que actualmente es también profesor en la Universidad de Maryland. Branko Milanovic ha escrito este libro, que es un libro muy importante, es un parteaguas, me parece, en el entendimiento de la desigualdad, porque nos aporta muchos elementos nuevos para el entendimiento de la evolución de la desigualdad en el mundo y también para entender la evolución de la desigualdad entre países. Es un libro que, como hablaremos con el autor, aporta muchos nuevos elementos para el entendimiento de este fenómeno, revisa la trayectoria histórica de lo que ocurrió en muchos países y lo pone en un contexto de la nueva globalización. Es un libro que trasciende a sus antecesores y que se monta sobre ellos para aportar nuevos elementos a este entendimiento. Así es que hablaremos el día de hoy con Branko Milanovic. Branko, welcome to Mexico.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's very nice that you are here because we are actually in a situation in Mexico in which inequality has become a very interesting topic. For many, many years, inequality was considered a taboo in Mexico, somehow, in the public discussion. Right now, we are starting to discuss about inequality. Mexico is one of the countries with the largest inequality in the world. We belong to Latin America, and in Latin America is the region with the largest inequality in the world. And in recent years, there have been new studies that show that Mexico has a degree of inequality which is among the largest in the world. Different studies suggest that. Even the official institute in Mexico is updating their statistics just to try to capture precisely that. So in that sense, it's very interesting that you come to Mexico at this moment to help us to understand more about inequality. Now, your book is more about global inequality or inequality in the context of globalization. Why don't you make like a brief summary of what is your book, and then we talk a little bit more about in detail about your book.
Yes, as actually you said, the book is really about global inequality. You know, it is important first to kind of, I know sometimes it's boring, but it's important to define what global inequality is. Global inequality is simply inequality among all individuals in the world. So strictly speaking, it's the same as if when you study inequality in Mexico, you take everybody who lives in Mexico into consideration. When you study global inequality, then you take the entire world. Obviously, it's much more difficult to study global inequality because the data are more difficult to obtain. And the movements in global inequality are determined largely by big countries like China, India, the United States. Also Mexico, which is of course a big country and it's increasing, but it is still relatively small compared to India or China. So that's where the movements come from. But I would like also to say, when you mentioned that inequality was a taboo in Mexico, it was a taboo implicitly in many countries, including the United States. You know, until maybe the global crisis happened, essentially there was this belief that inequality doesn't matter, then even if it's high, it will be fixed by the market or by the redistribution system, so we should not really waste our time studying inequality, we should really focus on other issues. I think luckily that has changed. I think it has changed in Mexico, and as you said, actually Mexico belongs to the Latin American countries. All Latin American countries are countries with very, very high inequality, even if inequality in some of them, including Mexico, although the data are not totally consistent, is on the decline. So it is a very, still an unusual situation that these are countries with very high levels of inequality, but inequality which is not getting worse.
Okay, so it's very important to understand precisely this differentiation about what you said. One thing is global inequality, so the distribution of income or wealth even among all the members of the world, and income inequality within countries, which is probably one of the topics that is generates a lot of discussion in general within the countries. But your work is mostly about global inequality. What would you say is the most important result in your book in terms of global inequality? What do you contribute to our understanding of this issue in Mexico?
You know, there are many important issues, and I will maybe list some of them, but obviously the most interesting and the most important one is the one that received most attention, and actually it is in the first chapter of the book. And that's why I put it in the first chapter of the book. And this is so-called elephant graph. And what the elephant graph shows, it actually looks at the last 25 years in the world. It lists all individuals that are included there according to their income, and then looks at actually how much their incomes have gone up at each individual percentile of the global income distribution over the last 25 years. And what it finds is that largest increases in percentage terms were around the middle of the global income distribution, where you have basically the Chinese population, just to simplify. And then you go towards richer people in the world, and you find Western European and American middle class, and there you have zero growth in real incomes. And then you go even further in the global income distribution, and you come to the global top 1%. And there you have massive increase. So really what that graph and the data behind that have shown is that we have actually had very contradictory movements. We have the emergence of something you might call global middle class, which is a good news, but then you had really almost no growth in large segments of population in the West. And of course that led to the issues with Brexit, Trump, Le Pen, and so on. So that was, I think, most dramatic result, but there are many others, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of them.
Okay, just thinking about your elephant graph, so it is true that your data show that there has been an increase in this emerging global middle class, which actually are, most of the people belongs to Asian countries, is the people that has seen a very important increase in their incomes, starting from low levels of income, but an important increase. And then we have this mediocre performance for all of those who are like in the upper part of the distribution, which are mostly people from these developed economies, which helps to explain a little bit of these social events that we have seen in recent years. But then we also have this other part, which is in the upper extreme of the distribution, in the top part of the distribution, which is the dimension that probably has generated a lot of interest and discussion in the world, including the 1% movement, this idea that the 99% of the population, for example, in a country like the US, has been left out of the progress of this, and that all of this progress, of most of it, has been concentrated in the upper part of the distribution, in this top 1%. What would you say about this upper part? Because it's interesting how this discussion on inequality actually helps us to understand different phenomena, including country-specific phenomena like what we have observed in the US, like what we have been observing in the UK, but at the same time help us to understand the whole movement about the income distribution. And there seems to be a tendency to be concerned about this growing concentration of income and wealth among the upper part of the distribution, the top 1%, the top 0.1% of the population. What would you say about this segment, the one that you call the plutocrats in your book?
Yeah, you're right, actually. Of course, as I described the results, of course, the very important result is that accumulation of income at the very, very top. And what is interesting about that, there are several aspects there. First of all, when we look at the percentage gains, they are a little bit misleading because that group comes originally into the play, as it were, with large incomes. So their percentage gains are maybe the same as the percentage gains of people in Asia, but in absolute sense, their gains are enormously bigger. So that when you actually do a different calculation, when you say, okay, how much had the world income increased between 1988 and 2011 to 2013, and you say, well, this is 100, who received that? And then you find that about 45 of this 100 was received by the top 5%. So then you have really a very different view on who actually benefited from globalization. And what was interesting there is that it reflects not only increase in top 1% in countries where there was an increase in inequality like India or China. It reflects, of course, in the United States, certainly in Mexico. In other words, what we have seen is really we have seen a kind of a polarization within countries in the very, very top. And the danger there is that these people whose incomes are, of course, shooting up, they're also accumulating savings and wealth. So the differences in wealth inequality between the top 1% and the rest are even greater. And then, as you mentioned, actually, political implications of that are very serious, because if we go back to the position of the middle class that we talked like a few minutes ago, that middle class in the rich countries is then feeling squeezed between on the one hand, people who are poorer than them, but who actually are threatening their jobs, you know, export, outsourcing, import of Chinese goods and so on. And then in front of themselves, they see the top 1 or 5 or even maybe top 10% in the United States who are doing very well. So they really feel, I think, squeezed economically. They are threatened for their jobs by people who are actually willing to do work for much less. And then they see in their own countries, they see that the top 1% or the top 5% have done extremely well. So I think this is really politically a very difficult situation.
Thank you for that. I'll come back to the discussion about what can we do about those issues. But before moving into that, I would say something about which is called the Kuznets curve. We have, from the middle of the past century, these studies by the Nobel Prize, Simon Kuznets, that provide an interpretation of what could happen to the income inequality in regards to the development of a capitalist economy.
Right.
And his view, for some, which is considered like a too rosy of the perspectives of what could happen in a capitalist economy, the idea, basically just to summarize it, was that there should be an initial stage of the development of a capitalist country in which income inequality would inevitably increase, but eventually it would start to decrease once a country reached a certain point of development. So that seems to be like an idea. That's actually probably the reason why when someone started to think about inequality in the countries, the discussion moved away from this issue, because the idea was, well, you know, let's start to think about how to make the pie grow instead of thinking about how to distribute the pie, because eventually distribution will improve. That was the idea behind the Simon Kuznets vision. But then came along Piketty, an author, a French author that you know very well, his work, and his work was a little bit more pessimistic. His view was, well, Simon Kuznets was wrong, and the capitalist economy, in some ways, will lead inevitably to an increase in inequality unless we do something about it. So his view was a little bit very critical, I would say, about Simon Kuznets' view. But what you propose in your book is actually a different interpretation. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and why do you think this is a better explanation of what could happen eventually in a capitalist economy, that as long as it evolves into a richer economy?
You know, the Kuznets explanation was, as you said, actually, that there will be an inevitable increase of inequality in the beginning, and then there will be also somewhat, not inevitable, but likely decline, because people will get more educated, there will be demographic transition, there will be demand for social services. As you get richer, then you want also protection, insurance, and then all of these forces, including, he believed, there will be decline of income from capital would kick in, and then there will be decline of inequality. And actually, when you look at Kuznets' curve between late 19th century in the developed countries and 1970, or even 1980. That idea does actually a pretty good job. You know, there was an increase from the late 19th century, there was a peak, either in late 19th century, early 20th century, and then there was a decline. So it does a pretty good job. The rejection came when actually that theory could not explain the increase in the last 40 years. And although Piketty never actually said that, of course, that increase will continue, he implied, or actually other people implied, that it was something imminent to capitalism, and consequently that period of the decline was, I called it actually in my review of Piketty's book, El Periodo Especial. So that was the story. But I believe that actually the Kuznets curve can be rephrased in terms of Kuznets waves. So that actually the first part which we just described was the first period of globalization and technological change, which of course resulted eventually in the decline of inequality. But then there was the second period, similar to what happened in the late 19th century. We have globalization, we have large technological change because we see really companies making enormous amount of money now, new companies that didn't exist 10 years ago. If you look, for example, at market capitalization of companies like Amazon, Apple, and all of that, like 20 years ago, they didn't exist. So we have really technological change, and that has led to the increase of inequality similar to what happened 100 years ago. Now, in my book, I say they actually, Kuznets saw the first wave, but he could not imagine there will be a second wave because basically he did not actually predict that there will be a continuation of such technological revolutions within the context of globalization. Now, the more difficult part, and I will be very brief on that, is what are the forces that could check or reduce that inequality? And there, obviously, we are on much more shaky grounds. I list some of them, like, political change, the rejection of such policies of lower taxation and so on. There is also the fact that the rents that I was mentioning before would gradually be eroded by competitors. The possibility of technological change would be biased in favor of low-skilled labor because, high-skilled labor has become very expensive. So there are different possibilities, but, we cannot really sort of pinpoint to what exactly will happen. But I think that they are fundamentally offsetting forces to the increase in inequality when it becomes unsustainable.
Okay, that's an interesting, a very good explanation of your ideas behind this, the waves, the Kuznets waves. An interesting thing about that, it seems to suggest that there are some self-regulating mechanisms that sort of put a top, I mean, like a break. Once inequality increases too much, some mechanisms seem to operate so that start to bring back inequality towards more moderate levels. That seems to be implicit in the idea of the wave, right?
That's true.
There is a recent author that I'm sure you know, Schedel, that suggests that there have been some elements in history, some catastrophes somehow, that actually operate to bring back inequality to a more moderate levels. What do you think about that? Or do you think it's more like the implementation of policies, more like catastrophes? What's your reading of that interpretation?
That's a very good question. Let me just say, for example, in my book, and I talked about that now, I was talking about what I call the benign forces that could lead to the decline of inequality. So that's why I meant the erosion of rents, political change, higher taxation of inheritance. So these are what I call benign forces in the sense that they are reducing inequality, but they are not destroying people or capital. But I also mentioned there are also malign forces, the bad forces. And of course, that's something which we have known from history, is the role which was played by epidemics, by wars in particular. So within that same context, I mentioned that, of course, you can argue that World War I was such a sort of malign force that eventually, because of the imperialist competition for territories and higher returns, which was driven by inequality in those countries, eventually you had a clash of irreconcilable imperialist interests, which sort of eventually led to the war. So I mentioned that in my book, and I actually quite discuss it. Now, what Walter Scheidel does is that I think he, in my opinion, focuses only on such forces. I'm not as pessimistic because I believe that there are also forces that are inherent to the system that can actually bring down inequality without major catastrophe. But I also have to say that I agree that major catastrophe is not impossible. We actually really talk today much more about likelihood, unfortunately, of a major war than 10 years ago. So that could happen. And I just hope it will not happen, but I think that it's not excluded. Actually, I have to mention I have a paper with 2 co-authors which takes the idea from my book, which I mentioned, the endogeneity of World War I. In other words, inequality leading to what I said before, to imperialist competition and to war. And actually we study on the data before 1914, high levels of inequality, high levels of investments, the fact that these assets were owned by the rich people, and these assets, foreign assets, were giving very high return to them. So there are similarities between the pre-1914 and today, unfortunately.
Okay. Now, this series is about great thinkers. And one of the great thinkers that you quote in your book, in different parts of the book, is Marx, Carlos Marx.
Right.
What would you say about, first of all, about the contribution of Marx to our understanding of these issues in the actuality, and what's the role of Marxism or Marxist concepts in your book?
Well, the role, I think, is very large. Let me just divide it into 2 parts. The first one, which will be very simple. Marx did not write about what we consider today income inequality, which is inequality between individuals. Because he assumed, like Ricardo before him or Adam Smith, that essentially inequality meant inequality between capital owners and workers. And this is, of course, true for the 19th century world, but today's world is more complicated. We have among these top 1%, we have people who have very large, huge, so-called labor incomes, because they are chief executive officers, they are top managers. We cannot kind of put them under capitalists anymore, but of course they have also large capital incomes. So Marx, as I said, did not write on this specific topic much. However, Marx's analysis, I believe, is absolutely indispensable to understand the distribution of income between owners of capital and wage labor. And it's actually really, without his analysis of capitalism, I think we are basically at a loss. And that's why actually I use Marx a lot, and he has influenced my own thinking since I was in high school. So this is not something new. Actually, I don't think that anybody has had such a perceptive analysis of how the capitalist system works, how the government in capitalist system is very largely representative of moneyed interests, and we see that much better now even than in Marx times, because nowadays we have democracies, but these democracies are not evenly representing people, because they basically depend on money and the funding by the rich, who then obviously spend that money in order to influence the first parliaments and then the governments to make policies that they like. So as Marx called it, actually the government then becomes the executive council of the moneyed class. So in many respects, I think Marx is absolutely, I think, essential for understanding the topic of the distribution, even if he did not write on distribution between individuals in the way that we now study it.
So, but then that implies that the economic power or can capture political power somehow. That's what I understand what you mean by when the government acts as the executive power of the rich.
Yeah, that's what I think. Actually, it is, and of course, I think it is actually quite well represented in Marx's works on political economy, and actually his writings about what he called the civil wars in France and other, books, is that really this link between the moneyed class and political power. But I have to say, it is present also in Adam Smith, very strongly. And Adam Smith has been, in my opinion, intentionally misread, because Adam Smith, of course, is in favor of free trade, but he is very skeptical about the power of the moneyed people, because they are few in numbers, they can coordinate very well, they actually can buy the politicians. You have the same idea there. And in my opinion, what is also unfortunate is that the economics in the last half a century has really gone away from these issues, which are really linkage between economic power and political power, and they have gone into a sort of a belief that we are all agents somehow, that actually if you are rich and I'm poor, we are both agents maximizing our utility, and we should ignore the endowments, we should ignore with how much capital you come into the game and what other advantages you have. And I think that has made economics really inapplicable to today's world, in some parts of economics.
Okay, I found this this idea of bringing back the concepts from Marxism and to rethink also about the contribution of Adam Smith in this regard, truly fascinating. I think these are one of the things that I learned a lot from your book. So I'm very happy that you did that, because for someone like me who studied a lot of Marxism in my BA studies in Mexico back in the 1980s, it sort of shows that it can be useful even to understand today's world, because sometimes it seems like it's far away from that. And I think in that sense it was very interesting to read that in your book. How do you make use of that? And also about historical context in which Marx wrote his pieces, how that might help us to understand a little bit of today's world, even though some of his concepts and some of his interpretations might be wrong. So, but it still seems very interesting. So I'm very happy that you did that in your study.
You know, I actually think that, of course, the essential part, well, of Marxist analysis for us, for people who work on income inequality, is really the emphasis put on class. Now, the classes are no longer as sort of sharply delineated as they were in the past, when you had all rich people being capital owners and other poor people being workers. Although, for example, it is more relevant for Mexico than, for example, for the United States, because Mexican structure, class structure, I think, is still more sort of, in that sense, more sharper. But I think the class analysis is useful in any society. You know, I grew up, for example, in a socialist society, but Marx analysis was useful there as well, because you had also different class interests. They were actually called, you know, there was a officially classless society, but of course it was not true. There were people who were actually an upper class, and there were people who de facto exercised control indirectly over the means of production, and people who were able to actually get for themselves a larger chunk of the pie. So, you know, that emphasis, that realization that we are not just atomic individuals who have same interests, but that our interests are determined by our position in what we call our position in the process of production, and of course with our endowments. I think it's absolutely crucial for any society. You can actually study ancient societies with the same sort of a view. And as I said before, it was something which was present in all classical authors and which unfortunately had been then forgotten.
Good. Now let's move a little bit towards the future. At some point in your book, you sort of present some, I would say, speculations, but based on analytical results that you have also studied in different contexts. But you make some speculation about what could be the evolution of inequality in the future in the world, and you discuss some situations that could affect in one way or another the evolution of income inequality. What would you say about that, just to make a summary of that, and then we can discuss a little bit about it?
When obviously, when we come to the future, it's obviously we all make predictions which might turn out to be wrong. But in this particular case, if we assume, I think somewhat rightly, that the growth in Asia, in particularly in China and India, but also in Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, which are all very large countries, will continue, and that the growth will be higher than the growth in the rich world, then these are the forces that would lead to the diminution, to the decline of global inequality. Now, what is also interesting, and that's one part of my book also we didn't have time to talk about now, is that you should really see, one should see that change, the emergence of Asia, and as a really globalization one, the previous globalization in a mirror image. Because what globalization was one was the emergence of Europe and North America as the poles of economic power and also high incomes, which led to a large increase in inequality. Now, Asia is recapturing the position that it had prior to the Industrial Revolution. And what was also interesting there is that deindustrialization, which happened in India with the British textiles in the 18th century, is now being replayed with deindustrialization of the West through the exports of China. So we are really going now into the mirror image of the first Industrial Revolution and the first globalization. But that mirror image with large increases of income of relatively poor people would reduce global inequality. So I think that's the kind of projection that we can make relatively confidently. What is the slightly problematic part of that projection is that Africa is becoming more and more important because of the large increase in population. And Africa is a continent that has not converged to the Western or to the higher income levels. So if Africa remains outside of the convergence, then at a certain point we will actually have a stop to the process of reduction of global inequality. And moreover, and that's why I actually focus on the role of Africa in the future, moreover, migrations of which are now Europe is seeing quite a lot coming from Africa and poorer parts of Asia, would then even continue or be increased because the population difference between Africa and Europe would become very large. You know, Africa would have in 2060, Africa would have 5 times or 4 to 5 times more people than the European Union today or the European Union in the future. So, you know, that actually would totally sort of be a magnet for migration. So in that sense, these are the things that we can now see as possibly kind of putting some doubts into that more optimistic projection of the rising global middle class and reduced inequality.
Okay. So this issue of the growing gap between the level of income in a whole continent like Africa,
right,
vis-a-vis what's going on in other parts of the world, might bring about all these pressures on migration, as you said, and we probably have to do eventually something about that as a human society, because we cannot expect that to happen without generating all these pressures in different dimensions.
Absolutely.
So we have this issue on the one hand with the very poor people that lives by millions in Africa, but also we have these other problems in middle income societies and in relatively more developed economies like in the US and the UK and in Europe in general. We still see this process in which the fact that the income of those in the middle class of the population is not growing, and probably will not grow in the future as a result of all this globalization that we have already had. So, do you foresee tensions growing in these relatively developed economies on the one hand, and on the other hand we have like middle income economies? Latin America is there, right, where we are sort of in the worst of both worlds, because we do not have like the established social safety net that developed countries have, and on the other hand we still have large segments of the population in poverty. So what would you say about these two regions of the world?
No, of course I can more easily say what I think about the situation of the middle classes in the rich world. As you described them, I think that actually currently this sort of a wave of what you can call pluto-populism, because there is a plutocracy element and sort of populist element, is reflective of the dissatisfaction of the large parts of the population with the effects of globalization and fear of migration. And I have to say that fear of migration is particularly strong in Europe, but we should not look at migration as something which just happened. We should see migration, as I was saying before, as an integral part of globalization. In the same way that capital goes from rich countries to poor countries because it can make more money by employing people with lower wages, you know, people from poor countries go to rich countries because they would actually earn more money. So that process, I'm afraid, for the rich countries would continue, because I don't see that there would be a stop to globalization even when China becomes relatively rich, and it's already going in that direction. But you have many other countries that are much poorer. They will be actually representing similar problems to the middle classes in the Western world. Although, obviously, you can say maybe it would improve a little bit because China was such an explosion in the terms of number of people and in the terms of exports. Maybe that actually as this sort of a bubble sort of recedes, there will be smaller pressure. But to go to the question that you asked me about the middle classes and actually middle income countries, I know actually that they are to some extent also under the pressure of lower skilled labor from Asia, for example. And on the other hand, in principle, and that was very clear in the case of the relationship between the US and Mexico, you would have actually expected that for the same reason that we say China has benefited from exports to the West, Mexico should be a large beneficiary there in relationship to the US and with the NAFTA. But that actually is not something we have seen. You know, despite all the rhetoric in the US about Mexicans taking American jobs and all of that, the results are actually, for the Mexican side, are relatively modest. And so we have not seen that same development here. So in that sense, we have maybe a sort of a contradictory situation that middle-income countries like in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, and so forth, are really experiencing some of the pressures coming from lower wage economies, but may not be or might not have been able to use very well their relative advantages vis-a-vis the richer countries. So this is one of the problems. And the second one, as you mentioned, is that basically the levels of income here and historical experience has not led to a type of social safety net which exists in Western Europe and the United States. So implementing them today under the conditions of globalization, I think, is much more difficult. Because one should not forget that you cannot simply replicate in different historical conditions what happened in Sweden in the 1930s. In Sweden in the 1930s or Germany in the 50s were societies with almost full employment, with very large manufacturing middle class, working class, with large trade unions, and with ethnic homogeneity, and under the threat of the left-wing sort of communist parties. So then, obviously, capitalists and trade unions, socialist trade unions, created a sort of a modus vivendi, which was then translated into the welfare state. And that was the conditions before globalization, free movement of capital, and free movement of labor. So it is very difficult, I believe, today for the middle-income countries to actually replicate something which happened in Europe in the 1950s or even in the 30s under very different conditions.
But couldn't be that this inability for these middle-income countries to replicate this situation that happened in all these Western economies, wouldn't that lead to a raising pressure towards more the malign forces than the benign forces combating inequality? I mean, in the sense that it seems like, what I infer from what you say is that it's going to be very hard for these middle-income countries right now to try to fight against this increasing inequality that we are observing in these middle-income countries, using the same instruments that were used in the past in the Western economies. So, so what could be the solution to that polarization that is growing in some of these countries as a result of this pressure which is coming from the two parts of globalization? One is the lower wages in all these very populous countries in Asia and maybe eventually in Africa, and on the other hand, the fact that capital is so mobile and therefore you cannot do something that you could do in the past.
Yes, I actually, of course, I don't like to sound very pessimistic, and I don't know too well the conditions here, but I'm just very skeptical that, as I was saying before, that some of the remedies to high inequality which were used in the first part and the second part of the 20th century can be now replicated, even in the rich countries, and much less even so in the middle-income countries. Which, of course, then leads to the question, as you said, wouldn't that lead to a malign forces that really unsustainable inequality? And I do believe that what is happening now in some Latin American countries, including Mexico, with an innovation which was the use of conditional and unconditional grants to actually give small amounts of money to people in order to actually improve their conditions, is not an accidental development. It is an attempt to address the conditions of poverty and to create some social welfare net when the replication of the 20th century, early 20th century Europe is not possible because of globalization and entirely different conditions, and something ought to be done. So I believe that, obviously I could say, well, you can increase taxation, you can do other things to help the poor, but oftentimes I think it's very objectively difficult. But I think what could be done, these are small things, but certainly the very top of the income distribution of all these countries has been relatively unaffected. We have seen for example, all the scandals like Albert scandal, like Panama Papers, others. So clearly there is a way to actually focus on the very top of the income distribution. The second thing I think is really important, I know that everybody repeats that, but it's education. So access to education to all different layers of population, and not have really, as we have in many of these countries, a fairly elitist education. And the third thing is continue with innovative and new systems of social coverage, which may not seem very ambitious, but I think under the conditions where the trade unions are relatively weak, movement of capital is free, movement of labor is not free, but it's actually, exists more than in the 1950s of Europe. So we really cannot expect much more on that level. So again, I would say taxation of the very top, even access to education, and innovative social programs to help the poorest people.
Excellent. Now, do you think that we should think somehow about putting a limit in globalization, at least in one dimension, I'm thinking? And that has to do with the issue that you just talked about, which is the mobility of capital, which I'm in favor of that, but the mobility of capital, when it goes to all these fiscal heavens and leads to this information that we just recently know about the enormous amount of resources that are being put in all these places, these countries, on these places where they enjoy fiscal benefits that in some ways undermine the fiscal capacity of nation states and so on and so forth. Do you think that we should think about putting a limit in globalization, at least in this dimension? Do you think it's something that is feasible?
I think that this dimension really has two dimensions. And again, this is something that I would like to draw on Marx, because oftentimes we use Marx only in his, as I was saying before, the analysis of classes, class structure, and the negative sides of capitalism. But Marx was a phenomenal student of good sides of capitalism. And one of the good sides was actually ability of capital to move worldwide and to actually increase incomes and employ new people and to expand its sort of domain of action. So in that sense, I am very much in favor of free movement of capital, because without that free movement of capital, we would not have had people in rural Indonesia or India or Thailand or even rural Africa improving the standard of living. Even in Eastern Europe, movement of capital from Germany has helped countries like Romania, Czech Republic, and so on. But there is a negative aspect, the one that you mentioned, which I think now we are going to pay much more attention, but we have more data. And it is linked to corruption, and it is linked to actually avoidance of taxation. So that's basically what all the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, which actually show you the tip of the iceberg, because it is much more widespread, are showing us. And they also show us the collusion between the top Western banks and sort of organizations like, for example, London, which has become really the center for money laundering in the world, because it is able to use all the other links to different parts of the former or current British Empire, like obviously using Hong Kong, using Cayman Islands, using Bahamas and all of that, and Channel Islands which is strictly speaking Great Britain, United Kingdom rather. And that's actually this sort of a negative or malign aspect, where essentially you had corrupt money And corruption, I think, has increased tremendously in all countries in the world. It's not only that we know it more now, I think it has objectively gone up, and then in attempts to avoid taxation. Now, this is just to conclude, this is not only limited at individuals who, of course, steal that money and go either buy an apartment or in London or New York, or put them in shell companies in the Cayman Islands. It is also the case with large companies. We have seen large companies that pay almost no taxation. I was actually looking, I think it was a Starbucks or Apple that in Europe was selling billions, and the tax rate which they paid, and I'm not joking, it was 0.0001%. And I was actually saying that, I don't remember what was the exact number, but I said, if I were to pay such tax in the United States, my tax would be $18. So that would be my annual tax, $18. So I can actually go and buy maybe like several hamburgers, and this is my tax rate for the United States. So clearly, this is something absolutely logical.
And do you think something can be done about that? I mean, feasibly? In the sense that, how do we put a stop into that? I mean, we all know that that's an issue, not just because it's money laundering that might come actually from illegal activities, might come from corruption, as you mentioned, but also might come from legal sources. But in the end, what all of that is doing is undermining the fiscal capacity of some states. And in that sense, the question is, can we do something about it? I mean,
you know,
feasibly?
When you say we, it's actually, again, we have to decompose the we. Yeah. Because the countries can certainly do something. I mean, they have a power. If you put the European Union alone against all these companies that pay ridiculous amounts of taxes, there is no doubt that they will be able to do that. The question is, do we really have an incentive? Because who is the we? You have noticed that Ireland very reluctantly accepted to tax some of the companies because Ireland has built into itself into a tax haven. So when they were asked by the European Commission that they must tax the companies and receive $3 billion, they were really very reluctant to do that because basically they don't want to tax companies. So there you have very different interests. And it's very difficult to imagine that under current conditions, if you take the example of last night U.S. tax bill with hundreds, actually read, or maybe 4,000 lobbyists putting in different bills, clearly you will do nothing because all of these lobbyists have an interest that actually the system continues and actually becomes worse. But in that sense, so long as we don't have a very clear distinction between the political sphere and an economic sphere, I don't think that we can do anything. But once we have a different situation where actually the power of the state would be indeed used against people who are doing that, then I don't think that there will be any doubt that, I mean, you can actually squeeze. These are not very powerful countries, you know. These are islands. You can actually very clearly, if you really wanted the United States to actually go against them, as the U.S. actually has gone against Switzerland, in the case of the Holocaust accounts that were kept by Swiss banks. Switzerland is an important actor, but nobody can convince me that, you know, the Bahamas could be offer much of a resistance to the United States if they wanted to do something.
Okay. Now, the thing is, with all these resources going into these places, these fiscal havens, which mostly belong to the plutocrats or to the people in the upper part of the distribution, doesn't that sound like an alarm in terms of in this balance between benign forces and malign forces? I mean, doesn't things like the recent pass of the tax bill in the U.S., which benefits mostly to the people in the upper part of the district, do not all these elements are things that actually go against what one should expect, given the risk that we have of putting too much pressure in terms of inequality and distribution of income, and to generate more elements for the rising of these malign forces? Shouldn't that something that should be taken into account by people taking these actions?
I agree with that, and I think that's one of the reasons why we are here and having this conversation, because without that, nobody would be interested in this. But because people are interested, we are having this conversation. And I think that actually this kind of an open use of political power for economic interest, which we have seen in the US tax bill, is just simply unmasking what has been happening for years or for decades. And in that sense, I see that, this kind of a plutocratic rule that we see under Trump is simply a continuation of plutocratic rules which are simply more sophisticated, where you were actually receiving money from different sides, but you were not obviously showing this off. And so I'm actually in that sense optimistic. Once you actually rip the curtain and show how actually it is being done, as we now see in the US, it's actually being done with sort of practically secret addendums put into the bill in the middle of the night, I believe that that would actually lead people to realize that something seriously is wrong, that something is wrong, that something seriously has to be done to fix that. So in that sense, I'm cautiously optimistic that when the system of this kind of a plutocratic manipulation of democracy goes to its own extreme, then people would realize, and that there would be a backlash against that.
Okay. Now, I remember reading in one of your books, this is just moving a little bit to the Mexican case, which I don't know how familiar you are with this, but I know that you know something at least about Mexico, because I read that in your book, in one of your previous books, in the haves and the have-nots. That was also published in Spanish in Spain,
right.
if I remember well. You have a vignette on who was the richest person in history.
Yes, yes.
And you make this very interesting exercise about that, comparing the wealth of different people in different times in history and in different places. And your conclusion is that a Mexican was the richest person in the world. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that exercise, and we can talk a little bit about that, because I think that's part of the reason why the inequality issue in Mexico actually started attracting a lot of attention, because of that specific case. But why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, that was, I think, an interesting exercise. What I did there, I did the following thing. I said, okay, let me try to compare incomes in different times. With how are we going to compare them? We don't have consumer price index to convert Roman incomes into today's incomes. It's very difficult. So actually, I use something that Adam Smith said, is that the man is rich by the quantity of labor that he or she can buy. So that actually provides you an interesting insight how to measure wealth. You say, okay, let's look at the wealth. Let's suppose I have 1 million. How wealthy I am, and then we have data on average wage of a worker, even in Roman times, in Byzantine times, even in Aztec times, we have the data. So I said, okay, and we have data about people's wealth. Again, back to Roman times, we have data actually about Crassus. We have data about, emperors like Octavian. But I deleted, I didn't want to include emperors. And people, you can say, because they really use public money like their own money. So really, it's not the same thing. So I said, okay, let me look at private individuals. And there, what was interesting is, of course, you have people from Roman Empire like Crassus, but then you have a Rockefeller, and then you had, of course, Carlos Slim, then you had Bill Gates, then Warren Buffett, then Carnegie, then all these people. And we have data about their wealth. And when you translate their wealth in the number of wage units at that time in the country where they live, you get an estimate of the wealth. Now, what was interesting with Carlos Slim is that, of course, he is globally enormously wealthy. I mean, he's either number 1 or 2 or 3 in the world, depending on the year. And if you calculate him in the American terms, he is still obviously extremely wealthy, but he's less wealthy than Rockefeller in 1931, I believe. But then, if you calculate him in Mexican wages, he is by far the richest person in history. So in other words, actually, his wealth, which was acquired mostly in Mexico, in terms of Mexican wage labor, is the largest disproportion of the largest wealth that maybe ever existed in history. So I thought it was actually quite a striking fact, and I also believe that that particular approach enables us to really express wealth from different eras in a common currency, as it were.
Yeah, that was a very interesting exercise.
It's a common political currency also, because if you have a wealth that can buy wages of, let's suppose, 10 million people, that also means that you have incredible political power.
Exactly.
If you can basically create an army of 10 million people. I mean,
yeah.
Whether it's not a military army, but it's an army that would actually help propagate your ideology, your point of view. They would actually be paid for you to do that.
And that will make you eventually even richer.
Yeah, it would actually make you richer, because that army, so to speak, would actually propagate an ideology or which really is linked to your interests. So it would make you richer.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because, and that tells you a lot, I think, a lot about the level of inequality in Mexico, because at the same time that we have one of the richest persons in the world, we also have more than 0.5% of the population, more than half of the population living in poverty, and about 1/5 of the population living in extreme poverty condition. So I think that's very telling about the level of inequality in Mexico. Now we're actually running out of time, and I would like to ask you something about the end of your book. In the end of your book, you finish your book with some questions. You say, now what? And you ask yourself about some questions about whether, for example, will growth still be important, economic growth, whether inequality will disappear as globalization continues, and so on and so forth. Why don't you pick one of those few questions that you ask yourself and just make an argument about those, the answer that you provide to the reader, just maybe I think they're very interesting reflections, I think, about the future of inequality.
Yeah, I actually wanted to finish, I think there are 10 reflections about the future, even the future of labor, whether we should really fear automation or robotics. There was a question, maybe I would like to say something about growth, because we now have a group of people, and there are some views, particularly in the richest countries, that growth is no longer important, that we should actually do so-called degrowth because of the constraint, ecological constraint to further growth. And where I don't agree with that view is that because that view essentially says to the poorer countries that we really cannot accommodate you becoming middle class and becoming richer, because we have become richer in the West over the last 2 centuries. We didn't know that it would actually be so detrimental to environment, but now we have discovered. But now what can we do? So we cannot actually have the planet really accept a middle class of 5 billion people with a consumption pattern of the United States. So we really should not grow anymore. And I find that really quite bizarre, because that essentially means that we have to keep the current disproportions of income given, so that we have to let people who have become rich remain rich, and those who have become poor somehow not grow anymore. There is not realization among those people that growth is absolutely crucial if we talk about half of the population of Mexico being under some poverty line, and 20% of the population being above really sort of a minimal poverty line. Well, clearly, we have to solve that by growth. We cannot even solve it by taking money from Carlos Slim, because even that is not enough. So in other words, this is taxation of the top is a palliative solution, because it has some good sides of limiting political power, it has some good sides of redistributing the money, but it cannot be alone used. So growth is absolutely crucial. So when you tell them that, they say, okay, yes, well, we don't want to be really against the so-called third world, and Asia and Latin America and so on. So we would accept some growth on their side, and we would actually argue in favor of degrowth in the West. But this is very unrealistic, because degrowth in the West means that the problems of the middle class, of populism and all of that, what we just talked before, would remain unabated. So they would be unresolved. So in other words, what I wanted to say is that we have to be pro-growth, but we have to be pro-growth with 2 caveats. One, is redistribution, much more than before. And the second one is finding different environmentally more friendly technological solutions to growth. So we should not say growth, we'll just throw away growth and we will not worry about that, because it's utterly unrealistic and it's bad for people who are poor. But we have to do growth with redistribution and, as I said, with environmentally friendly policies. And I want to say last thing, that I'm a little bit there at odds with the left-wing view in many countries that is actually anti-growth. I think that the left should be pro-growth, because that's actually a solution to the problem of poverty. So we have people on the left have essentially given up on this issue and see it as a right-wing issue. But it should not be. Actually, left should be more pro-growth than rich people who already have enough income.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Branko, for this wonderful conversation that we have had. I think there are many, many topics that we could still go on and on and on. But many of those are discussed in this book and in other books that you have written.
Yeah, we could discuss this for hours.
For hours.
Thank you.
Así es que con esto terminamos esta espléndida plática con Branko Milanovic, uno de los grandes pensadores de la actualidad, que nos ha contribuido mucho a nuestro entendimiento sobre el tema de la desigualdad, de la globalización, de los efectos que tiene tanto a nivel mundial como entre países, y que discute en su más reciente libro sobre las condiciones que han llevado a esta circunstancia, sobre lo que puede pasar, mejora nuestro entendimiento sobre lo que está pasando en países desarrollados, en donde el crecimiento del ingreso en las clases medias ha sido sumamente lento y ha generado muchas tensiones en esos países, pero también lo que ha pasado en otros países muy pobres, particularmente de Asia, donde el crecimiento de sus ingresos ha sido muy importante y donde eso ha permitido lo que él llama una clase media emergente. Al mismo tiempo también habla en su libro y nos ayuda a entender lo que está pasando en esos países que están en medio de esto, están siendo, digamos, apretados, se enfrentan, por un lado, a la presión salarial o de lo que ocurre en los países con abundancia de trabajo y que por lo tanto presionan a la baja los salarios, y por el otro lado los países ricos donde está el capital y donde eventualmente termina polarizando, por lo tanto, la distribución del ingreso en algunos países de ingreso medio. Creo que todo esto nos ayuda a entender mejor el tema de la desigualdad, de su importancia en el mundo y de su posible evolución. Y por todo eso agradecemos mucho a Branko Milanovic el que haya estado con nosotros el día de hoy y sus contribuciones en sus diferentes escritos, en sus diferentes trabajos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Gracias.